Breaking news. The United States and China have officially reached a significant agreement to de-escalate their escalating trade war. Following intense trade negotiations held last weekend in Geneva, Switzerland, both countries have agreed to temporarily reduce tariffs on each other's goods for a period of 90 days. This development is being hailed as a potential turning point in the prolonged economic standoff that has impacted global markets and supply chains. According to CNN, the United States will lower tariffs on Chinese imports from a staggering 145% down to 30%, while China has agreed to reduce tariffs on American goods from 125% to just 10%. In a joint press conference in Geneva, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent emphasized the spirit of cooperation and mutual respect demonstrated during the meetings. He stated, "Both nations are committed to establishing a new economic balance. We have agreed to reduce 115 percentage points in tariffs over the next 90 days." China's Ministry of Commerce confirmed that both sides are committed to implementing the reductions by May 14th. In addition, the agreement outlines the creation of a new bilateral framework for ongoing economic discussions. Future negotiations may alternate between China, the United States, or a mutually agreed third country. When needed, the two parties can also initiate expert-level consultations to address specific trade and economic issues. This dramatic shift in trade policy follows months of intensifying economic tensions that began with both sides raising import taxes to historic highs. Before the current deal, the U.S. had imposed tariffs as high as 245% on selected Chinese goods, while the standard rate for most imports from China was set at 145%. In response, China levied retaliatory tariffs of up to 125% on American products. Global financial markets have responded cautiously to the news, with analysts suggesting this temporary truce could pave the way for a broader and more sustainable trade agreement if both sides stay the course. The 90-day countdown begins now. The decision to lower tariffs represents a major reversal in tone between the two global powers. Just weeks ago, both countries had taken aggressive stances, imposing punitive tariffs on billions of dollars worth of each other's goods. The sharp escalations had triggered fears of a full-blown trade war, with global supply chains bracing for long-term disruption. However, during the Geneva summit, both delegations emphasized pragmatism and economic realism over rhetoric. According to sources close to the talks, the U.S. acknowledged the strain that prolonged tariffs have placed on American importers and consumers, while Chinese officials voiced concern over instability in manufacturing and agriculture. To support the new agreement, the two nations have pledged to establish a rotating dialogue mechanism. This means future talks could take place not only in Washington or Beijing, but also in neutral locations such as Switzerland or Singapore. This flexibility is seen as a strategic step to ensure open communication channels and sustained diplomatic engagement. Experts believe that the new structure may allow both parties to raise sensitive concerns more freely without the high-pressure atmosphere of top-level summits. These working-level consultations will involve trade experts, economists, and policy strategists tasked with crafting future policy recommendations. For now, the mood in the international trade community is cautiously optimistic. Market analysts suggest that the 90-day window provides a rare opportunity for both sides to reset the tone of their relationship. Despite the hopeful outlook, some skeptics warn that the temporary nature of the agreement means underlying tensions could easily resurface. Key issues such as technology transfer, intellectual property rights, and access to domestic markets remain unresolved. Nevertheless, the immediate relief from high tariffs is expected to provide breathing room for exporters, manufacturers, and consumers on both sides of the Pacific. Many U.S. companies had previously expressed concern over the unsustainable cost of raw materials and components sourced from China. With the new lower tariffs, operational costs may decline significantly in the short term. China, in turn, anticipates a boost in its agricultural and tech exports to the U.S., sectors that have been particularly hard hit by the previous wave of tariffs. As a result, some rural provinces and industrial zones in both countries are expected to benefit from the new policy environment. The next few weeks will be crucial in determining whether this truce leads to lasting peace or whether it simply delays further conflict. In response to the agreement, both governments have begun coordinating the technical implementation of tariff adjustments. The U.S. Department of Commerce will publish updated tariff schedules effective immediately, outlining the revised 30% rate for most Chinese imports. Similarly, China's General Administration of Customs is expected to release new documentation reducing import duties on American goods to 10%. Trade associations across multiple sectors have welcomed the news. U.S. agricultural exporters, in particular, expressed optimism that the reduced Chinese tariffs would reopen stalled contracts and shipments. Soybeans, pork, and dairy products, previously targeted with retaliatory duties, may now regain competitiveness in the Chinese market. Meanwhile, U.S. manufacturing firms hope the easing of steel and electronics tariffs will restore predictability in supply chains. "This agreement gives us a chance to breathe again," said one executive from the auto parts industry. "We've been crushed by months of inflated component prices." Chinese technology firms, likewise, are reportedly preparing to ramp up exports of semiconductors, consumer electronics, and industrial equipment. The reduced U.S. tariffs could re-establish access to key American buyers who had scaled back orders during the height of the trade dispute. The decision to include a rotating forum for future talks also underscores a shared intent to prevent another escalation. Analysts suggest this could evolve into a semi-permanent framework for bilateral economic dialogue, not unlike earlier formats such as the U.S.-China Strategic and Economic Dialogue. Still, challenges remain. Tariff suspensions are conditional and can be reversed if either party perceives non-compliance or unfair advantages. Both sides retain the right to restore original rates after the 90-day period if negotiations stall or if disputes emerge over implementation. Observers note that political pressures in both countries could affect the durability of the truce. In the U.S., protectionist rhetoric remains popular in some voter blocs, while in China, state media continues to emphasize economic sovereignty and self-reliance. Despite these variables, the Geneva Accord marks one of the most constructive steps forward since the trade war began. The world will now be watching how both nations navigate the road ahead and whether cooperation can triumph over confrontation. U.S. President Donald Trump praised the talks between the two U.S. delegations in Switzerland, saying the two sides have restarted in a friendly and constructive manner. Trump wrote in a post on social media on May 10th, "A very good meeting with China today in Switzerland has discussed many issues and achieved many progress." Trump added, "We want to see China open up more to U.S. involvement because of the interests of both China and the United States. Great progress." However, the U.S. president did not give details about these progress. Earlier, senior U.S. and Chinese officials ended the first day of talks in Geneva in an effort to deter a global economic crisis. Reuters quoted sources as saying the two sides are expected to continue negotiations on May 11th. Chinese Vice Premier Ha Lijian held a meeting that lasted about 8 hours with U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Madsen and Trade Representative Jamieson Greer. This is the first face-to-face meeting between the two sides since Trump imposed high-tax tariffs on Chinese goods and forced Beijing to pay. The talks came after weeks of increasing tension because of the endless measures causing nearly $600 billion in annual bilateral trade to nearly collapse. Tensions between the two world economies, as well as Trump imposing tariffs on goods from dozens of other countries, have disrupted supply chains, causing instability in the financial market and raising concerns about a global economic downturn. Washington wants to reduce US $295 billion in trade with Beijing and urge China to abandon the US's unfair economic model. Beijing opposes what it sees as external interference. China wants Washington to reduce tariffs, make it clear what kind of goods the U.S. wants China to buy, and treat China as an equal partner on the international stage. Both sides have not made any statements about the contents of the talks, and have not made any significant progress since the talks at the UN Embassy in Switzerland. The talks ended at around 8 p.m. local time. On May 10th, the U.S. and Chinese delegations began the trade talks in Geneva, Switzerland, after a series of months of negotiations. The head of the U.S. side was Finance Minister Scott Wilson, while the Chinese side was Deputy Prime Minister Ha Liangfeng. Only a few hours after the U.S. delegation left for Geneva, U.S. President Donald Trump suddenly announced the possibility of reducing tariffs with China from 145% to 8%, which shocked Beijing. This move was confirmed by the U.S. as a proactive move to open up the talks and reduce the calculated increase. U.S. President Donald Trump handing over power to U.S. Finance Minister Scott Wilson was seen as a move to increase Trump's negotiating position with China. Although the final decision was still in the hands of Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping. The two countries' delegations, including senior officials who have participated in strategic talks, showed the seriousness of the meeting. The current goal is to achieve practical results, especially focusing on rare fentanyl and restoring the conditions from the one-stage trade agreement that was terminated. After the talks with China in Switzerland on May 10th, U.S. President Donald Trump said the two sides had negotiated on a completely re-establishment in a friendly but constructive way. U.S. President Donald Trump posted on his social media platform, "A very nice meeting today with China in Switzerland. Many things have been discussed. Many things have been agreed." Trump added, "We want to see, depending on the interests of both China and the United States, an opening of China to U.S. entrepreneurship has made great progress." However, he did not speak clearly about progress. The trade dispute combined with the decision of U.S. President Donald Trump a month ago to impose tariffs on goods of dozens of other countries has stirred up supply chains, disrupted financial markets, and caused concern about a serious global downturn. Washington is seeking to reduce trade tensions with Beijing and convince China to give up the economic model that the U.S. claims to be the dominant value and contribute more to global consumption, a trend that calls for a domestic reform. China has opposed what it considers to be external interference. Beijing asked Washington to reduce tariffs, clarify the aspects it wants China to buy more, and treat them as an equal partner on the international market. China's Xinhua news agency said in a comment on May 10th that China's determination to protect the interests and development of the country and China's position, as well as goals in protecting international equality, maintaining order economy, and global trade, have not changed. Speaking to reporters when signing an executive order in the White House, U.S. President Donald Trump said on May 9th that the U.S. would maintain a 10% for imports in all countries even after trade agreements have been signed, and said it could be exempt when countries issue important trade terms. When asked if countries apply a zero-tax rate will receive a response, U.S. President Donald Trump said there would always be a base rate. U.S. President Donald Trump said there could be an exception, but basically the minimum base rate is 10%, and one of those would be much higher, 40%, 50%, 60%. U.S. President Donald Trump said he hoped 4 or 5 other trade agreements would be reached immediately. On May 8th, U.S. Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick also mentioned this content and said in the next month the U.S. would announce dozens of new trade agreements. In an interview with CNBC, the U.S. Secretary of Commerce said in the next month the U.S. would announce dozens of new trade agreements. When asked if a 10% base rate would continue to apply to all countries, the U.S. Secretary of Commerce said, the U.S. Secretary of Commerce said the 10% base rate would apply to all countries with a trade balance with the U.S. Meanwhile, countries with a trade gap with the U.S. may have to face a higher rate. The U.S. Secretary of Commerce added that Washington is aiming to reduce tensions with Beijing through upcoming trade talks. On May 9th on social media, U.S. President Donald Trump commented. A few minutes later, U.S. President Donald Trump continued to say that the 80% rate for China seems reasonable according to Scott B., mentioned by U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. These comments by U.S. President Donald Trump were made ahead of trade talks between the U.S. and China. According to British Reuters, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and U.S. Trade Representative James Mason Greer are expected to meet Chinese Vice Premier Han Lifeng in Switzerland at the end of this week to discuss economic and trade issues. This could be the first step towards resolving the global economic turmoil. The meeting is expected to take place after months of increasing tensions between the two countries, in which the level of tariffs imposed on each other's goods has exceeded 100%. The two sides have fallen into a tariff war in which neither side wants to be seen as giving in. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said on Facebook that the U.S. imposed a 145% tariff on China and a 125% tariff on the U.S., which is equivalent to a ban. He also said that the current tariff war is not sustainable. The meeting at Geneva was described by U.S. President Donald Trump as a step towards easing tensions with China. According to CNN, U.S. President Donald Trump, on May 9th, suddenly announced support for increasing tariffs on oil, despite the fact that this topic is causing great controversy within the Republican Party. Trump said, "I really want to do this." Basically, the top level will accept the sacrifice to share the burden for the middle class and low-income people. This is a redistribution, and I am always ready to accompany the American people. I will give some of what I have to help the people reduce the burden on taxes. President Trump explained that in addition to supporting the middle class and the working class, increasing tariffs on oil is also a way to continue running essential welfare programs, including the Medicaid insurance system. According to observers, Trump's statement is quite surprising, because the White House owner used to be associated with super-rich policy, and he himself is also a billionaire. Some U.S. officials revealed that President Trump is urging the House Speaker Mike Johnson to increase tariffs from 37% to 39.6%. for those with an income of more than $2.5 million a year. However, many members of the Republican Party have publicly opposed Trump's idea, emphasizing that their position is not to increase tariffs on anyone. Senator John Thune, Republican leader at the Senate, told Fox News, "We will not increase tariffs on any class. We are trying to reduce inequality for all Americans. We will not increase tariffs on any class. We are trying to reduce inequality for all Americans." The International Monetary Fund said that both the U.S. and China have great economic and financial benefits in reducing trade tensions, but a long-term stalemate is still very far away. Eswar Prasad added, "However, the two sides initiating high-level negotiations is a significant step that opens up hope that they will restrain their speech and step back from more aggressive economic relations." Donald Trump's administration's negotiating team was led by U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. Bessent once said that current tariffs cannot be maintained for long. Accompanied by him is U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer, architect of Trump's early trade strategy. In it, there is a Phase 1 trade agreement between the U.S. and China and trade advisor Peter Navarro. Meanwhile, the Chinese delegation is led by Vice Prime Minister Ha Lepeng. The Chinese government has not confirmed who will go with Ha Lepeng or if Wang Tianhong, But the U.S. and China will meet on 10 to 11th of May at the World Trade Organization headquarters in Switzerland. The organization has repeatedly criticized Trump's tariffs. It warns that the global economic split may reduce GDP by 7% over the long term, especially to poor countries. The organization's spokesman said it welcomed the U.S. and China's trade relations could cause deep economic instability. U.S. consumers who are familiar with Chinese cheap goods could soon face anti-trade and low-priced goods. The U.S. President Donald Trump is currently running for the signing of a trade deal with 17 major partners after U.S. leaders temporarily postponed the tax cuts he announced in April. Mr. Tram Ngoy, a deal just reached with the UK, as evidence that his tax strategy is taking effect, said that recent signals from the White House show that they are ready to reduce taxes is a positive thing.